All right, good afternoon, everyone.
Has he got better written on the side?
Yeah, it's like.
And welcome to this first afternoon session of today's proceedings. My name is Johnny Murray. I'm a lecturer in film and visual culture at Edinburgh College of Art, and it's a real pleasure and privilege to host and moderate this first panel session on the subject of the filmmaker in film education. And central question we'll be discussing with our guests, who I'll introduce in 2 seconds, are the things that which practicing filmmakers bring to the experience of teaching films. As I say, I'll introduce the panel, ask them to say anything very briefly they wish to in terms of informal opening remarks about that central question. We then have 4 questions for discussion. We'll take about 10 or 15 minutes on each, in the hope that we'll then have 10 or 15 minutes at least to open up to wider discussion, conversation and questions from the floor. So, from my left and in alphabetical order, I'd first like to introduce Jamie Chambers. Jamie lectures in film at Edinburgh College of Art, is founder and general editor of the journal Film Education Journal, and his written work has also appeared in numerous other places, including the academic journal Screen, which of course is edited from the very building which we're sitting in. He's the organiser of this event, the Scottish International Film Education Conference, and also the writer-director of the 2013 fiction feature BLACKBIRD. And then I have Emma Davie. Emma is reader in film at Edinburgh College of Art, and she also leads the postgraduate programme in film directing there, with a particular emphasis and interest in documentary cinema. Her own extensive career as a documentary filmmaker has encompassed works which are made for television broadcast, but also for theatrical release, and includes the international award-winning documentary features I Am Breathing from 2012 and Becoming Animal from 2018. And like Jamie, Emma is also a writer and has written extensively about issues relating to documentary practice in Docs magazine. And then last but not least, I'd also like to introduce Gideon Koppel, who's Professor of Media at Manchester School of Art. Gideon's work as a filmmaker has traversed fiction and documentary formats and traditions. His works include the 1998 multi-part Channel 4 documentary series Undressed, Fashion in the 20th Century, and the internationally acclaimed 2008 documentary feature Sleep Furiously, which is now widely seen as a seminal work of early 21st century documentary cinema. So welcome to the panel, and before we get into detailed questioning and roundtable discussion, I just wondered whether there's anything you would like to say in terms of an initial short response to that question, that overarching question. What is it in particular that practicing filmmakers bring to teaching film?
I'll dive in. Just to add to what Johnny said, I've been lucky to have the experience also of working in primary school classrooms, teaching practical filmmaking, and also secondary school classrooms as part of the Cinéma Centre de Jeunesse project that Steffi was talking about earlier. And I've actually just written a piece on this, which is in the current edition of the Film Education Journal, on this question of co-creation, I suppose, which I think Johnny's going to get to in his question in a minute. But one of the things that really interests me as a filmmaker is, no matter whom I'm working with, whether I'm working with an 8-year-old student or whether I'm working with a 35-year-old student or a 50-year-old student, I personally feel that there is an aspect of, I don't quite know what the right word for is. I mean, I've been using the word co-creation, the word collaboration, maybe, it feels a bit uncomfortable in some ways, but I feel that whenever I am working with students who are making films, no matter what age they are, there is a degree of creative process that I'm actively involved in, and I'd be very interested to know what Emma and Gideon think about that.
I was thinking about this question, turning it around actually, which sounds a bit of a selfish thing to do, but I think actually it provokes interesting questions. So the question is, what does teaching bring the filmmaker? Mm-hmm. And I became a tutor, really because I've been working in broadcast for a long time, and I felt slightly frustrated at the lack of exploration that was possible within that genre. And so teaching was a way of exploring questions. It wasn't a way of being an expert and sharing knowledge. It was a way of finding a community of other people that were also interested in asking questions of documentary. And I think the thing that I feel about documentary as a form is that it's a young form, and its possibilities are endless. And I love the sense of sharing possibilities with people who might be young filmmakers, might be filmmakers who I might work with elsewhere too, because I also work as a mentor and teacher elsewhere. But rather selfishly, it brings me a lot as a filmmaker. And I think as long as it brings me a lot, then it's a meaningful process. So the danger comes when it doesn't bring me something, and when it becomes something that I feel like I know what I'm doing. I'm never really on safe ground as a teacher. I always feel like I'm slightly out my depth. And I think charting the unknown, charting these sorts of spaces of vulnerability is what really interests me. And sharing that. Sorry, have I talked too much?
Yeah. But it's hard to follow on, because I think what Emma says is very, very profound. I was thinking about the question in terms of what not inverting it, and I think the inversion is a much more interesting possibility. But what do I bring in terms of my role as some form of teacher or tutor or mentor? And I guess it's confusion. I kind of bring confusion and chaos into the environment, and it's sort of intended, because I think that a lot of the filmmakers, students I work with, have been educated in a culture where learning is about eradicating questions. It's about kind of solving them, and also that things should make sense. And I think it's kind of interesting, or for me it's interesting, when things don't make much sense, and living with what is a sort of uncomfortable feeling of things not making sense.
Okay, I hope we'll have the chance to explore all of these opening remarks further in discussion, but let's pick up with a first question, which maybe comes back to something that Emma was saying. Listening to all three of you, I found myself thinking not so much about the idea of inversion, but almost like a Mobius stripper loop, where one's filmmaking experience informs one's practice as an educator, while one's practice as an educator simultaneously informs how one thinks and works as a filmmaker. Would each of you be willing to say something about what those processes of mutual informing have been like within your careers to date?
I mean, I have only recently been teaching in universities. I've been teaching in universities for now 2 years. I kind of taught at the University of Glasgow here for a year, both at postgraduate and undergraduate level, and I've now taught for the best part of a year at ECA. And interestingly, I don't feel I've ever been more stimulated in terms of wanting to in terms of what I want to go out and do myself after this. Actually, I think that there's something about, as Gideon and Emma have put very beautifully and poetically, about this the risk and the vulnerability in the sense of exploration, but also I think, you know, I was thinking some of the words that Emma was using there. Emma was talking about, used the word community, and I think that there's one of the things which is wonderful about a filmmaking process, whether to an extent, whether it's in an educational environment or not, is the togetherness of it. There is a very social aspect of it, and I think that as I say, after 2 years of teaching very sparky undergrads, postgrads at both Edinburgh and Glasgow, that sense of sharing that sense of risk and vulnerability I have found very energising as a filmmaker, and more energised than I felt maybe before, I started teaching in kind of higher education environments. So absolutely, I think that there's definitely a sense that there's an energy coming out of that process, which I find it difficult to kind of narrow it down to a concrete instance or but it's the sharing of the risk, the sharing of the possibility, the sharing of the confusion, and being in that space with other people is very conducive to onward motion, I suppose.
Do you feel that higher education today allows you to advertise that, or is there a sense that one can have these risky questioning experiences, but there's almost a don't ask, don't tell aspect to it? I'm very aware that a lot of higher education now is about quantifying, systematising learning outcomes, concrete timetables,
primary and secondary education,
project structures. Yeah. I imagine some of the core of what you're all talking about, which is really important, is also inimical to the way in which a lot of higher education is now structured, and students' expectations in terms of thinking that their tutor will be confident, will always be organised, is there to provide a structured mentorship and teaching experience.
I mean, I hope organisation and professionalism is still, that's a given.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't use the word organised. I think that is still part of chaos. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's. I think you're still teaching within an organised. I think there's a way that structure can be used to actually allow more looseness and more passing into that unknown territory. But I think what is demanding, and I think you're right there, Johnny, is a sense of the rather rigid nature of timetable structure, which is needed for them to do other subjects or something like that. That can be really difficult within film, and I think that can feel slightly alien to, for example, having to look at rushes which might take 40 minutes to look at, but you have a half-hour tutorial and you have to fit your discussion within that form. But I think more than that, I think there's something about the way that universities present themselves as being so bureaucracy heavy to a student's experience that actually gives a message that we have to really, I don't want to use the word fight, but we really have to kind of throw creativity at that to stop them being intimidated by that. And I'm sure we all know what we're talking about, because every university has those structures which it uses to run smoothly. But I think in the old days it seemed to be easier to immerse people, for example, in a whole day of screening films. And these days doing things like that can be, and we've shared these problems at lunch across different institutions. I don't think I'm just talking about our institution. I'm sure we all share that, and maybe that's where we can have a meaningful discussion together about how we create that immersive culture where people are breathing film as so much a part of their everyday lives that they can't help but discover things themselves. And ultimately that's what we care about as educators, is creating a modus operandum where people are discovering things for themselves and are by nature so curious that actually it's that curiosity that takes them further and further and further to discovering the language of the film that they need to make. So I think that's the thing that I think I'd love to hear a wider discussion about, is how in the face of institutional ways of doing things we create this other atmosphere. I mean, sometimes we're successful at it, and I think the students manage to still make good films, but I think it is more of a struggle to be... I mean, filmmaking by its nature has to be subversive, I think. And so, how you're subversive but still within that structure is an interesting question.
What's the experience been like? I introduced you as Professor at Manchester School of Art, Gideon, but you also had much experience working at Aberystwyth University as well. But some of the things that Jamie and Emma have been talking about there, do they also chime with your own experience as an educator?
Yeah, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because I'm actually very pessimistic about higher education, and I feel it's very rarely spoken about in those terms. But higher education was privatised, and I think that has changed it, and that has changed the culture of education. It's certainly changed in a way that I don't feel comfortable with. I don't feel at home with. But I want to come back to the earlier question that you asked, and it sort of provoked in me, and I was thinking about it again when Emma was speaking. I remember when I first started teaching, a student asking me the question, I think it was to do with assessment, which has always been a sort of slightly uncomfortable thing for both students and I think for people teaching. Although, anyway, the question was, so Gideon, what is a good film? And for some reason at the time, I had a simple answer, which in a sense I stand by, which for me a good film is a film that makes me feel differently about the world. I see the world in a different way, even if just in a very, very slightly, if my notion is sort of slightly fractured, changed in some sort of way, and part of that is because for me, and this is an entirely kind of subjective and personal thing, film, and maybe I should qualify film by talking about cinema, is a sensory experience. And it's a sensory experience both as a viewer and as a maker. And I think that that doesn't sit comfortably with current policies on education. Which are kind of governed at the moment by notions of employability, or and I don't think that universities do much to and in fact I think it's not only the universities, it's us who work in them don't do much to promote that. I mean, you mentioned that I taught in Aberystwyth. I taught for a much longer time at Royal Holloway, teaching now in Manchester School of Art. Certainly in those three institutions, none of them have viewing facilities that are fit for purpose. In other words, you cannot show, there is nowhere that you can screen a film and view it as a piece of cinema. And there might, I mean, clearly Glasgow is a place that does have it. This is a kind of cinematic auditorium. But most of the time in those institutions, I was showing films in lecture theatres where you don't have a sensory experience. How on earth can you in some way encourage students to simply enjoy and engage with a cinematic experience if you don't have a cinema? I mean, to me, it's bizarre, and yet will the institution invest in the basic facilities? No. I mean, I've had that in all three institutions.
I suppose what you're describing almost sounds like an institution saying to an English literature student, we have Jane Austen novels in the library, but we've removed every 8th page. So you can get an approximate sense of what the work might be.
Yeah, well, in fact, in Aberystwyth, they did that. When I started teaching there, they had this great scheme in the library because they wanted to make it more appealing to students. So they took out the bookshelves and put in bean bags and vending machines. And the students preferred it. That's for sure. It was much more pleasurable for them. But that, for me, isn't education. I mean, in some ways, education has to be about introducing the unfamiliar in some way and making the unfamiliar start on some level, if not to become familiar, at least to engage curiosity. And it seems to me there's been discussion about teaching in schools. I know nothing about school teaching, but the little bit of undergraduate teaching I've been doing recently, and I mainly do postgraduate, so I don't come across that much, I kind of get the feeling that most of the students have had the stuffing knocked out of them in terms of curiosity. Curiosity has become a kind of anathema. It's something that you simply don't you don't acknowledge. And I think that curiosity has got to be the driving force of everything you do.
Jamie?
What if I could just add to that? It seems to me that something that I feel I'm noticing in universities is a kind of almost like a process of hyper-rationalisation to an extent, and I feel that which to a certain extent maybe comes from a certain pervasive neoliberal notions of how things can be organised and made into kind of effective process. But what, and just to kind of counter that, and one of the really wonderful things about being in so many different institutions recently is that not only have I feel I've been learning from my students, but it's wonderful to learn from other teachers, and I've learned a lot from Emma. I've been able to kind of have these nice little windows of sitting in on Emma's teaching, and something that Emma said to our postgraduates when they were fairly fresh in the door last semester really struck with me about this. Emma told them that she didn't. I hope you don't mind me repeating this.
I'm just slightly worried about what I said.
Well,
yes.
we are recording this.
Emma said that she didn't want them to make safe films, and she didn't want them to make this kind of safe cookie cutter. What's the sort of film that's going to be selected by a festival and kind of, and you know, maybe potentially win a prize. And Emma said that she'd rather that they made kind of, you know, messy films that maybe failed in some ways, but really explored something and grasped after something. And I just to kind of come back to this point about rationalisation, I wonder if we are too concerned with what films being successful or kind of, or whatever we think is successful, and maybe there isn't enough space for failure's the wrong word, but for grasping after things that can't easily be grasped after.
Well, and ultimately that's about ideas, and also, although I think also about not treating the student as a consumer.
Yeah.
And I think the student as a customer is the most dangerous. The concept of the student as a customer is the most dangerous thing for our work. We're not here to. I mean, this was touched on earlier in the discussion. I think it's really important that we're not here to please or to create prize winners, but we're here to question the place of filmmaking within our culture. I mean, that's hopefully what we're doing. We're not just the students in their way and us in our way. We're all trying to work out, well, what's the point? We've got more than enough moving images in the world. So if you're going to create more, why are you doing it? What's it about? And, you know, I think we hold a big responsibility within that. And I mean, I have to say, I still feel a responsibility, unlike Gideon, to have a sense that the students are also gaining some kind of skills to get work and leaving. So somewhere I feel like we have to hold the two of experimentation and risk of failure and finding your own voice and not really knowing where you're going, and also developing, I mean, going back to this word training, developing some kind of training where you will earn some kind of living, because we know what kind of debt you're going to be in when you leave, and you know, all that. I feel a certain responsibility to all of that, but that shouldn't dominate. That's not why they're here. It's just, it's amazing how quickly someone learns how to edit if they've got something to say. So ultimately it goes back to that. It's amazing. It's like you learn French if you need to communicate about something. If you're just doing if you fall in love, you learn French, I think. But, you know, and in a way it's the same with a film. Fall in love with your film and suddenly you need to learn how to use one of these blooming FS5s or whatever, but don't go there to learn one of those things.
Yeah, it's cart before horse.
Exactly. It? So in a way everything serves the central question of, like, you know, why are you doing this? What's this about? How can you actually do something that's meaningful to you, that you have a relationship with, and not I mean, often when students come, they have this notion of like, here's this idea, what do you think of it? Like, it's slightly removed from them, and it's almost like it's got to have some kind of life that is going to sort of exist that isn't to do with what they invest in it. It's very strange. And I think so much of the learning actually is about actually going back to real basics of trying to work out why you're doing this in the first place.
But I think then if you go back to basics, my feeling is about specifically teaching film is I become less interested in the film, in the object of the film, and I'm more interested in the process. And certainly working with postgrad students, for quite a long time in the course, I would not introduce cameras or recording equipment at all. So, for instance, one of the first things I did in Manchester with a group of students when I started last year was I really liked the tram system in Manchester. And I like this idea of a city with trams. And I got Manchester Transport to give me a big wodge of tram passes. And then I put numbers in a hat, and each student picked out a number. And then I said, okay, that number is a tram route, and I want you to spend one day, it's up to you to kind of pan out how the day works, but one day travelling from one end of that tram route to the other end of that tram route, here's a pass to do it. And you get off the tram whenever you feel like it. It might be, you have to go for a pee, or you're hungry and you want to go and eat something, or you see a dog that you like in the park and you want to get off and just say hello to the dog, or whatever it is. And no cameras, no sound recording equipment, no notebooks, no stuff. And then the following week they'd come back and they just talked about their adventure. And I think what most people discovered is, first of all, that they could describe things. They could. I hate using this word story. I think this idea of storytelling has become a kind of fetishized thing, and I'm getting really, really probably too truculent about the way it's about kind of resisting the way it's used. I when I made Sleep Furiously, I was very nervous about what was emerging while I was filming, and so much so that I phoned up Margaret Matheson, the producer, and I said, Margaret, I just don't know what the fuck I'm doing, and it's certainly not what you and the film Wales and all other people think that I'm going to be doing. And she said, well, I'll come down to Wales and we can talk about it. And she came down to Wales and took me out for lunch, and we were talking. And one of the things that emerged in the conversation was that I was reading a play at the time by Peter Handke, and the play was called Casper. And I said to Margaret, that play embodies something about the film that I want to be making. And she said, well, we'll go and talk to Peter Handke. And I said, how? And she smiled. She said, you'll find a way. And then she wouldn't talk about it anymore. And kind of left me with that. And I did find a way of writing to him. And the people that sort of I knew, who kind of knew of him or knew him, said, he's really grumpy and he won't want to talk to you, blah, blah. But he replied, and he said, come and have lunch. And we had lunch, and we talked about all kinds of things. But at one point he asked me about the film I was making, and I described what I was doing. And he said, so what's the problem? And I said, because I don't have a story. And he started talking to me about stories, about what stories could be. And he started talking about stories not as this kind of heavy, dramatic arc, which is the kind of soap opera story. But he talked about stories as being moments. That a leaf falling off a tree is a story, or a tear rolling down a cheek is a story. And I found that so liberating. And I suppose when working with students now, that's become, for me, a kind of, not for all students. I mean, that's another thing, is that for me, a film course is not about learning to make a film, but it's about looking and listening. And if you're very lucky discovering a sense of your own idiom. And I think if you can do that within 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, then I think that's great. And what you do with that, how you translate that into something that becomes commodified, because a film is a commodity. It's not made for an audience of one. It's made for a mass audience. That for me is a kind of matter of chance. Who knows what happens with that. But I certainly don't get involved in that part of it.
Do you all have a sense that this very contemporarily pervasive rhetoric to do with story within film culture and film education, that it's a bit like Emma's idea of the student who comes in with an idea, and the idea is somehow already there, untouchable, external. It's about just almost mechanically realising it rather than undertaking the kind of much more organic process of exploration and discovery that you talk about.
I mean, I think working with documentary is so different than working with fiction. I think the challenges of teaching fiction are immense, which I'd really love to hear from people here, because I think it's such a wealth of experience in the room. Teaching documentary is so much easier, because actually people naturally have to be much more fluid in their response to ideas and to what they're encountering, and to much more open to learning and receiving, whereas those of you involved as scriptwriters will know that in a way I've got to that stage of writing a script, and Jamie can talk more about it, is such an achievement. Then to, you know, there's a certain sort of trajectory that you then go on with to realise that, which means that it has a certain effect on how you defend that idea, and it feels like turning that idea is like turning an ocean liner. Whereas documentary makers seem to kind of be these amorphous sort of shapes that can fit in under doors and in art galleries and whatever. You know, we and I think we are also kind of much more. I don't think traditional storytelling is so much is so established within the documentary making genre. I mean, I think we tend to refer to it more as a sort of meaningful structure than necessarily storytelling. But anyway, maybe Jimmy can talk about
I had
fiction.
a conversation recently with the screenwriter David Hare, who was saying that he thought almost 70% of his work was like being a defence attorney. And that once the script has been realised, it's very much about defending it from outside attack, contamination, change. And I get the sense that for a creative documentarian, that idea or experience would be very alien.
I think so. I mean, I think you know, when you ask what you've learned from your own practice, I think what I've learned from my own practice very much is, and I mean, just to go back when I began working as a filmmaker, I don't think I was really quite prepared. I think quite early in my career, I got a big commission for BBC and Canadian broadcast, and I wasn't really ready, to be honest. And so something that was an idea that I cared a lot about, which I thought would end up being this quite radical work, actually was so questioned by all these broadcasters and funders that I really was quite naive in the face of it, and I didn't know how to defend that work. And I feel like a lot of what I'd like to make sure students are able to do on leaving is to have a certain agency to defend their work once it's in a certain space. But if they defend it too quickly, like if I defend something too quickly, then I'm not actually receiving the sort of manure that it needs in order to grow. I don't know how else to explain it. So it's like, when do you defend and when do you open yourself? I think is a really interesting question.
But there's sort of conformities that I think should be questioned. I mean, I for instance, this idea that if you distinguish between fiction and non-fiction, that fiction should have a script. I mean,
sure.
Why is it that you know, over 100 years into the history of cinema that there's still this singular text which is the only way of describing the work or that is mapping the work. I find that bizarre. And that's propagated by film schools. I mean, it's, these are things that education should be questioning, not simply going along with. And another word that comes up in every institution that I've been at, which I again kind of makes me want to I just get very angry about this word industry. As if there is some sort of fucking industry. There isn't. And curiously, I made commercials for a long time. And curiously, in that, I was very resistant to doing it. And I did it because I was broke. And I just made a film installation for a fashion company called Comme des Garçons. And so that kind of made me, in a way, fashionable. And so advertising agencies were interested in me making commercials. And I was seduced into it. But I became interested in it because there I was working with very, very tightly written scripts, so-called scripts that I had nothing to do with. Mm-hmm. But they were scripts that had to be very articulate in terms of sound and image in a 30-second time frame. And so it became semiotics in action. I mean, so you might have a script that says that the commercial opens in a shop, and you go, okay, how in 3 seconds do I describe a space as being a shop? What makes a shop a shop? What are the signifiers? And that became really interesting. And that then was a very, very different notion of scripting, because in fact it became very much to do with thinking about images, and not simply visual images, but oral images. Because you had to use every resource available to generate that sense of where you were or what was happening.
Jamie, do you want to come in and build on any of the remarks from Emma and Gideon at this point?
Well, I mean, starting just with this idea of script and what you were saying, Johnny, and actually I remember you wrote something in New Scottish Cinema about the heavy focus on scripts in Scotland at one point in Scottish film culture, the idea that kind of everything kind of stemmed from the script as the kind of core document. And I mean, I share a kind of sense of suspicion and anxiety about that, I suppose. And I see it as reflectant of a certain neoliberal notion that, there are just recipes out there to make a film, and if you get the recipe right, it's replicable, and you can be maximum productivity, and if I think backwards, you have things like that. It can be a formula almost, like a kind of like a piece of architecture that you can have some sort of, you can produce a platonic notion of the film, and then you have to. Someone once said to me when I was studying at the LFS that you spend your time as a scriptwriter when you have a drama coming up with a perfect film, and then you spend your time on set screwing it up, which I think is what Emma's saying about the kind of the liner that you're trying to you have this immaculate document, and then how do you reconcile that with the unruliness of but just to kind of counter that, I mean, some of the filmmakers that really excite me, I mean, I've been thinking a lot recently about Chloe Zhao. I don't know if anyone's seen the films of Chloe Zhao. Made Songs My Brothers Taught Me, and more recently The Rider. And she makes films with this enormous sense of risk, where she works largely with non-actors, she works in a community setting, and she has no idea what she's going to shoot the following day. And what she'll spend a day shooting, and then at the end of the day she'll watch the rushes, and then she'll decide what she's shooting the next day. And so I think, I completely agree with what Gideon's saying about, the script. The script can have this just tyranny within drama, I think, which needs to be, as Gideon says, educational spaces are places where that should be challenged. We shouldn't be encouraging students just to kind of have this perfect recipe. And two final things on that. Firstly, it's in terms of that tyranny of the script, I heard this great anecdote about Lynn Ramsey, one of my favourite directors, who And she was talking about the tyranny of the script, where you have this script, and then that becomes a shot list, and it becomes a call sheet, and then and you know you kind of end up there on the day, and there's this enormous trail of paperwork that's telling you exactly what you're meant to be doing that day. But apparently what Lynn Ramsey does with every day is with her DP is kind of, you know, they've got the plan, but she says, no, let's throw that out the window. What are we doing today? Because something needs to burn in what is shot that day. If the film it can't just be a replication of an idea that happened 3 years ago. And on the final point, working in primary school settings is wonderful in this instance for me, again, thinking of that Mobius strip you were talking about, Johnny, because when I make a film with 8-year-olds in Grantham Primary School, our script is just one piece of paper, which has got kind of broad brushstrokes, you know, and we have a sense of largely what happens in a scene, but that leaves you free to respond to the unruliness of location and performance and everything that you find on the day, as it were. So that became a bit of a rant, but
how do you guys attempt to engage with some of these questions in your approach to assessment? I mean, the kind of teaching I do is different from you, but if I can try and explain what I mean, if I've worked with a student for 12 weeks, I often think the least interesting or useful thing for either of us to assess or talk about is the essay they produce at the end. And the least interesting or useful thing for either of us, for me to say about that essay, is whether my wholly subjective view of whether it's a C+ or a B-. And yet, university structures and prevailing academic conventions very much try and persuade and corral us into assessing things that maybe are not particularly suitable for assessment. This thing about curiosity, about experimentation, about uncertainty. How do you assess filmmakers, and when do you assess filmmakers, and why, as educators? And are there certain points at which you're actively resistant to the idea that something can or should be assessed in that schematic way?
I mean, I think the thing is, as a practicing filmmaker, deadlines are wonderful. Because actually I'd probably never make a film if I didn't have a deadline, because it's such a ghastly business, the whole business of trying to finish a film. A deadline really is so fantastic. And the same with you know, a course. I mean, you know, so I try to encourage students to see the deadline as their ally, even though it can be very demanding. And
I suppose the danger is that it comes back to Gideon's student's question, this idea that there is a good film at the end.
But I think that just depends how you set the learning outcomes, and you're making sure that actually you're building experimentation and exploration and curiosity and all these words that we've all been using as being so important within how you describe in advance how you're going to mark them. So it means that if they look for a safe place that isn't necessarily explorative, you can call them out on it because you've written that in this agenda before. But I think it's a challenge for people not to feel. I think where I find it very difficult is this thing that we have this mid-semester review when they've only been there 4 or 5 weeks, and we already have to give them an imagined grade, and that feels very difficult actually, because it feels like we don't want to be talking about grades at that.
You could do it without grades, surely, could you?
The trouble is then if they do very badly at the end and you haven't alerted them to it. I don't know. It is problematic. That I don't know the answer.
I think that for me there are 2 levels of engaging with that. One of them is the sort of the more philosophical idea of assessment, and by and large, I want students to feel encouraged by doing things. If they do something, if they make something, I sort of feel that's great. It's really hard to make something, and also when somebody makes something, in a sense, they're making themselves vulnerable, and the more vulnerable they make themselves, in other words, the more they give of themselves, the more I feel they ought to be reassured that that's a good thing. Then the other side of answering the question is the kind of the institutional way of looking at it. I was, this is 3 years ago, I was an external examiner I better not say which university, but it was one of the kind of major universities, and what's more, it was difficult because I wanted a job at that university, and I'd moved to the area, and they'd made me external examiner, and when I looked at the work, I thought this, and I looked at the whole kind of premise of the course. I thought this is not postgraduate standard by any means. And then I looked into the student body, and I looked into the whole nature of the course within the university, and discovered that it was one of the highest recruiting postgraduate courses. That I think 80% of the students were from Asia, so you're talking about really high fees, and there was no way that the university wanted any problems with that. But I thought, I can't say that this is okay. And when it came to the exam board, I said, I'm not signing off on this. This assessment is a sham. And I gave very clear reasons why. And the reasons were clear enough that the chair of the exam board had to accept them. And they didn't assess it, and they had to go back and they supposedly remarked, but they didn't remark. They simply just dropped the marks down. I resigned as an external examiner. Needless to say, I didn't get a job in the institution. But I think there are problems with that, because actually I think, unfortunately, part of my criticism of what's happened with universities is that I think there's a hypocrisy there. There's a hypocrisy about, on the one hand, wanting to claim a sort of educational values, and on the other hand, simply wanting to make money. And I find it very hard being in that position. And assessment is kind of central to that. I have been in exam boards where, not to do with things involving me, but sitting in on boards, or being on a committee, where somebody was told, you can't fail that student. It's kind of scary, really, on some levels.
I think counter to that whole system, I feel like, what we have to give, or what I feel I have to give the student in the face of this institutional demand, in the face of this process, in the face of everything, is some kind of faith that they will sort of get to the end of this journey that they're on. And I sometimes think, I know as a filmmaker I've been given that faith by people much more experienced than me, and actually that's all I've needed. Which is a very small thing, and I think you probably got it from Peter Handke. And I feel like, you can't underestimate that, just that complete belief in who they are, and that some transformative process will happen within a year on an MA that means that magic will appear at the end. And it's been my experience so often that that's happened, that I have confidence in the process, not just in the person, and that if the right conditions are created, incredible things can happen in a really short space of time. So, and often with the people who struggle the most. So the grades, I try to reassure them, are not that relevant. Ultimately what matters is, where is this journey going to take you, and how invested are you in it in a really genuine way.
Jamie, anything you want to add at this point?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Emma and Gideon has said. I think that there can be a certain pragmatic value to deadlines and targets. I agree very strongly with what Gideon says about, if someone is able to make a film, that's an achievement in itself, and I think that's something that we often don't give enough credit for. But I also, I think, going back to what Emma was saying about, this danger of the student as customer, and some of the expectations that come with that, and as Gideon's describing about not wanting to fail students or some of these, it does, there are very difficult situations, I think, that one finds oneself in. Yeah.
I think as culture evolves, I think it's important, if you're working in an institution, to redefine what that notion of failure is. And in the world that we're living in, for me, there are very few people who I think are failing, because I think they're struggling against such difficult circumstances. That
I'm going to ask one final question before opening up to the floor. It's to do with the idea of film credits. I'm always struck when you watch a student's graduation film, or the film that accompanies or that is a doctoral thesis, and usually the supervisor or teacher has a credit, and usually it's either just a general thanks or it's something like an executive producer credit. And it seems to me that within that is the idea that, to come back to an idea that Jamie flagged right at the start of the discussion, you have collaborated, that you have actively contributed to the work as it exists at that point in time. And I just wonder, thinking about your own respective experience as educators, what kind of words or metaphors would you use to describe your own sense of how and what it is that you actively collaborate on or contribute to the work of the students who you've cooperated with?
I was at the London Film School when Ben Gibson was there. Ben Gibson was there. For those of you guys that don't know Ben Gibson ran the BFI production board for a number of years. A key point in British film history, kind of presided at the time when the BFI was funding Derek Jarman, Peter Greenaway, and Ben very much within the LFS espoused this idea of the creative producer, the producer that wasn't just a person, doing budgets and logistics, but was a kind of creative influence on the film. And some of my tutors, when I was at the LFS, played that role for me. I think there was always a sense that I could take or leave their advice or input, but they would tell me to take scenes out of my script, or they would take me to take scenes out of an edit, or so that they had a kind of overall supervisory role of kind of guiding me along the road, but they would also make creative interventions. And I have kind of, because of that experience and having worked with some very positive figures, Margaret Glover in particular at the LFS, had an enormous role on a number of films that I made whilst at the LFS and after the LFS. BLACKBIRD, she was effectively a kind of creative executive producer on BLACKBIRd. So I often think about that role of the creative producer to an extent, and with the boundaries drawn differently for every project and every student to an extent, and it varies wildly depending on whether I'm working with an 8-year-old or a postgraduate student, I think.
And when I was listening to you talk before, I almost had in my head the image of an athlete's trainer. It's almost like the trainer in a boxer's corner. Because
of the faith thing?
Yeah.
I really don't feel like a trainer in a boxer's corner. I think I feel more like some kind of ally.
Someone who's got your back.
Yeah, that's what I feel. And I also feel like I'm very keen on helping them to share a non-verbal process. And I think that's a really important part of filmmaking. So a lot of tutorials are spent scribbling funny pictures and trying to work out what the filmic language is in ways beyond words. And I think I like to kind of think that we're looking for clues, and we're helping them look for clues, or to recognise what they already know, because I think people know much more about their films than they often articulate. So actually just trying to, I feel like I try to catch things that might otherwise not go noticed. So I just try and say, you said this, hang on, let's move that to the foreground and notice that and ask questions about that. I don't see myself like a creative producer. I don't really see myself as an executive producer. I mean, students use that credit if they want, if they feel like it might help them somehow to have this sense of the university behind them.
Yeah.
But we certainly don't ask for it. So I just see myself as an ally. Yeah.
Thank you. Gideon.
Yeah, I think that what Emma said was really interesting. I think that idea of helping somebody recognise something that is kind of the unknown known in a way, and thinking what Jamie said about reflecting on what tutors meant to me. I had fabulous tutors who still have a resonance for me. I mean, their voice is still alive for me. And I mean, one of them that first came to mind was Stuart Hood, who wrote On Television. And Stuart was my tutor when I was at LCP. He was just teaching part-time. And Stuart would watch something that you've made, and he'd either fall asleep or he wouldn't fall asleep. He didn't really talk about what he did, but it was very profound. I got very upset, and I'd work for days and days and days recutting something if Stuart fell asleep. And if he didn't fall asleep, I'd kind of celebrate with a cup of tea in the canteen, and that would be... And so that was... And then I did a postgrad at Slade, and Stuart Brisley was my tutor. And Stuart and I really only... We went occasionally to see Arsenal play at Highbury, and that's when we talked. But I don't think we talked much about work. I mean, it was about work. I mean, that's the point. That's where it becomes interesting, where what you have are conversations, and what the resonance of those conversations are, who knows? I don't know. I know what the resonance is of tutors for me, but I don't know what the resonance is that I might have
for the people you work with. We've got about 15 minutes maximum left, so I'm going to open up to the floor at this point. If there's anything that our panellists have said or discussed that you'd like to ask them or invite them to expand more on or respond to yourself, or indeed if there's questions or aspects of the topic panel which we have not yet covered. So please, anything anyone wishes to ask or share, please stick up your hand. Yeah, I'm just going to come to the gentleman here.
Thanks again, sorry for jumping in again. I just, coming back to, Gideon, you mentioned the kind of the myth of the film industry, and that, but my sense is, a long time ago, I worked in Soho, in that half square mile around Soho Square, which is the British film industry, more or less. My experience was people hated anybody who'd been to university to study film. And there was a great suspicion of anybody who had any intellectual interest in cinema. Now, I wonder whether that's changed. That was 20 years ago. Was that all? Oh, maybe it was. But whether there is, your sense in your teaching is, now again, I suppose my sense is, this is somebody who wants to make commercial films and make a living out of it. That in a way, whether doing an English literature degree is probably better for you than doing a film degree. I'm just interested in that question of what is film studies for, filmmaking education for?
I don't know. I mean, I think in some ways what anybody studies at university, unless you have a real strong sense of vocation, I suppose there's an arbitrary quality to it, and it's unpredictable where it goes. For me, and I'm nostalgic about this, and I admit it as being nostalgia. I miss the world of art school. I think there was something very particular. I mean, when you evoke this idea of Soho, and there's something very much to do with a certain kind of culture. And my association with Soho was being an art student at the Slade, doing a postgrad there, and having a very particular lifestyle and a very particular sense of freedom. I felt that freedom at the time. It was that I'm not being nostalgic about. That was a feeling at the time, and that simply doesn't exist anymore. I mean, I teach in an institution that's still called School of Art, but I suspect that branding won't last for long, because it's that doesn't fit government policies anymore, and that's different to university. I think the other thing that you mentioned is a much more general cultural one, which is that I think that intellectualism is a kind of dirty word in Britain. I think it has been for a long time, maybe always has been. And that's why I think the cinema culture in France is one of the reasons that it's different, is that you could be a filmmaker and an intellectual in France, and you can't really be here. Although interesting, this industry thing and filmmakers, Eleni bets for most people in the room, the filmmakers, if they were asked to think of British filmmakers, most of those filmmakers they think of will be people that were art school trained.
Emma, Jamie, can I ask if there's anything to be said about that question in terms of how it plays out in the Scottish context,
Yep.
a more local one, in terms of attitudes within the industry, within government, the kind of attitudes which our graduates encounter once they've left us?
I've heard a similar sense of disgruntlement to what David has described from some people in the Scottish industry about kind of film practice grads. What I would say alongside that, though, is we are part of a very involved process I think there's obviously, I think, university film courses are required to say that they're industry facing, and I think it's maybe something that a lot of courses will give lip service to. We have just gone through a very involved process of demonstrating and qualifying exactly how we are industry focused through a skill set accreditation, and I'm aware that there are bodies within Scotland that are looking at these precise questions as to how an ECA graduate or a Napier graduate will come out equipped with the skills to work in the industry. And that's a very specific, sort of probably technically focused career, I think. But that is something that we're thinking about on quite a detailed level. For example, we had a visiting lecturer, a kind of working producer in Scotland, who came in to give a talk to our undergrads, and was aghast that we weren't using movie magic, for example, and as something that he saw as being very important for young graduates coming out, maybe trying to get a job lower down the ladder in the industry. And that's something that we've taken on board. And so I guess it's a very long-winded way of saying that we are trying to take this notion of being industry facing and turn it into something which is significantly more than lip service, I think.
I also don't share Gideon's abhorrence of the word industry. I'm part of an industry, but I'm also, I hope, explorative in ideas about film. I don't see the two as being so antithetical to each other. I feel like you just have to find where will you get funding from countries where people are interested in exploration. And that, I think, is the clue. And that's what we try to do with our documentary makers is, well, don't just think about Britain. God, no. Think about where you're going to get money. You might get it in Denmark, you might get it in Belgium, you might get it in France. So duck and dive. Find places that actually are open to your discussion about film. And yes, it's the industry, but it's a healthy industry. So I think we try to actually challenge a notion that the industry is this little safe place in Britain of satisfying the BBC or getting a job in STV. Stuff that. That's just one side of it. Do that if you need to earn a living. But really, for your ideas and your vision to flow, look at many different countries and find work that can actually find funding in that. And it's not a dirty word for me. It's you can be as explorative and light with it as you can with the ideas that I think you can get excited by. I think otherwise you run the risk, in my mind anyway, of building up analogy to it, which is also dangerous.
Thank you. I think there's a question down towards the front of the auditorium. Yeah, please.
I was just interested to see what all the panel was saying about assessment. I find it very, perhaps even more frustrating trying to assess students in higher education than I did in school, which is extraordinary because assessment in school is terrible. And I wonder what you in all your roles now, how you kind of work with that or circumvent it, or kind of how you, because there is, as you point out, an institutional requirement to assess. And I wonder what just how how you work with some of that in your practice and how you view it.
For me, it's very simple. If I have to assess and give marks, I do give marks. I don't go through much rigmarole about justifying the marks, but what I do is I write a long piece for the students, as well as talking to them for for a long period of time. So there's a discourse. They get something that's written that they can contemplate, and also it's teaching at postgrad. So the marks aren't that important, and I make it clear at the beginning that I'm kind of not interested in marks. I mean that's not my preoccupation.
Do you ever have to justify that to other people?
Yeah.
I'm interested to know how you do that, because that's I think there's a conversation we have, isn't there, which I think is really interesting, particularly around in an environment which higher education is commodified.
Ultimately, I think that I justify it in terms that I think assessment has to be a discourse at postgraduate level, and also that for me one of the fundamental things is that I don't want to discourage students from so-called failing, and so I have to have very, very clear structures that enable that to be a sort of safe thing to do.
Do you guys want to come in on this, or shall I take another question? Okay, I think there was another question right down at the front.
Well, I also had a question. I like what Gideon was saying there about how you were talking about your students going on the trams, and rather than focusing on developing a concrete script, but you develop moments that people are just able to describe. Could you explain a bit more about how you then took that process forward? Did you actually go and make something after that?
Yeah, I mean, each student would take it in a different way, because some of them were photography students, some of them were film students, some of them were, and one of the things that happened certainly in that particular session was that some people discovered they were writers, but I think that it's interesting talking about industry and training and education, and I think that for me, teaching film is largely about looking and listening, and then there's a process of how do you translate that into something that becomes an object of some sort, that becomes something real, and then thinking about the camera. I mean, I'm very crude in that. I always kind of end up deferring back to Ziga Vertov and the idea of the Kino eye, but also the equivalent with a microphone, that a camera and microphone are microscopes, and you can see the world in a way that you can't see with peripheral vision. And that to me is a really important part of translation. And that so for instance, coming back to the question about film school graduate rather than a literature graduate, if you needed an appendix operation, would you allow an anatomist to carry it out? I mean, they'll know exactly where to go to, but they haven't translated that mapping knowledge yet into something that's tactile. Whereas I would hope that with film students there is a process in which their understanding of a cinematic syntax gets translated into something where they can make things.
That's probably a good place to end, John. I think that's what
Yeah, we have run out of our time, but before we take a break before the next session, can we thank our panel for their generosity with their time, also their ideas and their really rich shared experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny.